What a timely coincidence. I'm dying for a little drop of blood.
2021 seems to be turning into the year where I revisit the entire Castlevania franchise. Just when I think I'm making progress on my Lords of Shadow 2 video, much like the Quake Remaster, Konami just decided to drop the Castlevania Advance collection without any warning. And yes, for those still wondering, my Lords of Shadow 2 video is still coming. I currently have over 10 pages of notes, which is more than both the first games combined, so I have a lot to say, and I haven't even got to the DLC yet. I'm also currently balancing study commitments along with making content for the channel, and my Last of Us Part 2 video also took longer to make than I thought it would, so such is life, I guess.
Sorry, I got caught off guard back there.
I was likely going to cover these games at a later point, but with the release of this collection I figure there's no time like the present to go back in time and explore this classic Metroidvania era.
We better go slash some candles and save up.
The Castlevania Advance collection is now the third re-release collection from the franchise, following Castlevania Requiem in 2018, that packaged Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night, and the Castlevania Anniversary Collection in 2019, which contains 7 titles from the NES through to the Sega Genesis. This newest collection contains the 3 Game Boy Advance titles, along with Dracula X, oddly enough, and as with the Anniversary Collection, adds a bunch of quality of life additions and bonus content. Each game has all 3 different regional versions playable, which is a nice touch for those familiar with a certain version, even though there really isn't much difference between them. Mostly just the name differences and Harmony of Dissonance between the English and Japanese version. Each game's soundtrack is included to listen to as well, with Harmony of Dissonance and Aria of Sorrow having some of the best music, as series veteran Michiru Yamane worked on them, and there is also the option of making a playlist, which is kind of neat. There is also a very extensive art gallery here, which is very cool to browse through, particularly the art from Ayami Kojima, not related to Hideo Kojima. And it even includes the scans from the instructional manuals from each separate version, which I appreciate as I used to love reading manuals back in the day. The Advance Collection adds 2 main quality of life improvements over Anniversary in that now you can have multiple save states for each game as you play, compared to only having one in Anniversary. I shouldn't have to explain why this is a great improvement, I think. Having multiple saves is just a nice reassuring feeling. The biggest addition added here is you now have the ability to rewind the game at any point, a la Prince of Persia. It's a fairly handy feature, allowing you to fix certain mistakes like dying or retry jumps without having to climb all the way back up to the jump point. I have to say though that this feature I feel would have made a lot more sense in the Anniversary Collection, as these games are considerably more challenging than the Advance games. I wouldn't have minded a speed boost button, but that's mainly because I like to over-level and Circle of the Moon to mitigate some of its difficulty. My only real complaint I have here is that there is basically 0 options for the visuals, which I find to be a real odd omission. It's not that the games look bad, and I don't mind some pixels, but considering most emulators you can use on PC have various visual filters available to clear up or improve the presentation, it's a little odd that Konami didn't add this here, because if emulators made by fans can do it, surely it can't be that hard, but I guess this is Konami we're talking about.
They played us like a damn fiddle!
As I mentioned earlier, it is a little odd that Dracula X is included in this collection, as it was actually a Super Nintendo title and could have just been patched into the Anniversary Collection. There isn't a lot to say about that particular game. It was a reworking of Rondo of Blood for the SNES with redesigned levels and is a notoriously difficult game, but you can say that about most of the Castlevania games. I actually played this before Rondo of Blood as a kid, which was a game I didn't get to play until it was remade for the PSP in 2007. Hey Konami, where's the remaster of this, by the way? But enough of this frivolity. Let's dive into these classic games and what it is that makes them tick, shall we?
Then do it.
Castlevania Circle of the Moon, or simply titled Castlevania in Europe, was released as a launch title for the Game Boy Advance in 2001, and the first game to return to the Metroidvania style of Symphony of the Night, after the series had attempted a 3D transition with the Nintendo 64 titles. This title wasn't produced by the former series lead Koji Igarashi, like the other 2 titles, and is possibly a contributing factor as to why Circle of the Moon is no longer part of the actual canon of Castlevania. Though it's not as if this game has much in the way of a compelling story as it is. Dracula returns by some means, and a vampire hunter comes to stop him. You're not even playing as a Belmont here either, instead a training hunter named Nathan Graves. Though this is fine, as I've always been of the mind that for the most part, you don't play Castlevania for the story, and the gameplay is really what it is all about.
I've come to put an end to this.
And Circle of the Moon is definitely an interesting beast in that regard. In a lot of ways, Circle of the Moon feels and looks like exactly what it is, a launch title for the Game Boy Advance. Not to say that it looks bad, because it doesn't, but the visuals are a bit on the simple side, with backgrounds looking serviceable more than anything. The animation is probably my only real gripe presentation wise, with only a few frames used for character animations that it can look a little stilted in motion. Of course, to expect Symphony of the Night levels of animation in a launch title would be unfair and foolish, but the point still stands that visually, this game is just a bit lacking. The music, however, is decent, with a few great tracks, though not quite as memorable as Michiru Yamein's music. Gameplay-wise, Circle of the Moon shares similarities to both Symphony of the Night and earlier Vania games due to the game's much higher difficulty, tied both to enemy leveling and also much tougher platforming. This is a pretty hard game that has quite a steep difficulty curve in the beginning in my opinion, that I recommend grinding a lot in the first few hours to make Nathan stronger in order to lessen the combat difficulty, as like Symphony of the Night, this game and the next two entries lean into the light RPG elements with different stats like health and strength being affected by your level and what equipment you have. Level grinding was easy on a PC emulator with the speed boost, so unfortunately be prepared to hold circle for a while here if you're going to take my advice. Maybe watch the TV series to kill the time.
Tell it you're floating vampire Jesus here.
The magic system here is very cool however, and once you work it out, you can deal some pretty good damage on enemies with different spells. Basically, different combinations of cards you find offer different attacks or status boosts, like area of effect attacks or temporary protection. As I said, the platforming in Circle of the Moon is a lot harder and very reminiscent of early games in that you don't have as much mid-air control as Alucard did, and enemy attacks send you flinging dramatically backwards in much the same way as Alucard. This is compounded further by the actual mechanics of movement through the game, as many of the traversal mechanics are unlocked progressively through the game. First, you have to unlock the speed boots that let you run, requiring you to double tap the directional button to sprint, and then a lot of the platforming utilizes this technique of needing to sprint and then jump. I've never really enjoyed having to double tap to run in games, but once you get a feel for it, it's not so bad. I would strongly advise against using the analog stick for this game though, as it was really designed specifically with a D-pad in mind. Overall, there is a feeling that the controls are just a bit on the stiff side, and it's a bit unfortunate there is no block or dodge mechanic either. The other contributing factor I feel that makes Circle of the Moon a much harder game is that it is a much more non-linear game and a lot less guided than Symphony of the Night. Symphony and other titles gradually introduce a few roadblocks while exploring that's easy enough to make mental notes of, whereas Circle of the Moon is introducing these roadblocks constantly from very early on in the game that, despite the fact I've played this a few times, I still feel lost trying to remember which roadblocks can be unlocked by which new ability when I unlock them. So if you're playing this for the first time, maybe play over guide or get used to the fact you'll be backtracking a heck of a lot, as this castle really does feel like a labyrinth.
It's a piece of cake.
I know a lot of what I said sounds very critical, but I do think this is actually a decent game, in spite of its steep difficulty curve. If I were a real game journalist, I might say that this is the Dark Souls of Castlevania games. But if anything, it reminds me more of the design of Hexen in a lot of ways. And if you've played Hexen, you'll know exactly what I mean. Like I said at the start, Circle of the Moon looks and feels like what it is. A launch title, and the developers were likely still getting used to the limitations and strengths of the platform. Remember that we did end up with quite a few very impressive games on the Game Boy Advance, like Golden Sun being one of my all-time favourites, and then there was that wonder port of Driver 3, which is almost better than the console version.
Tanner, you suck ass!
1 year later, in 2002, Konami then released the Koji-produced Harmony of Dissonance, and this is honestly one of my favourite games in the franchise. This title is a sequel to Castlevania 2, set 50 years later as Simon Belmont's grandson, Just Belmont. Just? When his childhood friend Lydie is abducted, Just and his partner Maxim discover Dracula's castle has returned earlier than anticipated and set forth to rescue her. Harmony of Dissonance is a massive improvement over Circle of the Moon in many ways. The first obviously being visually. This is a much more colourful looking game, with more complex looking environments that feature a lot more background effects like clouded skies and much higher quality textures and scenery assets. There are a few reused sprites here and there from Symphony of the Night, which I think is fine, serving more as visual Easter eggs to me. Animation is greatly improved too, with Just and enemies having much more frames of animations, making everything look more fluid. He even has this cool ghosting trail effect that adds a bit more character to him. There are also these cool little visual set pieces in a few places, and destructible bits of levels that make this game visually a lot more exciting. Controls in this title are also much more responsive, with more control over jumps and faster attacks. Just is also able to dodge too, making combat more enjoyable, allowing you to avoid taking unnecessary damage, and you can also speed dash from the get-go, making exploration and backtracking much faster, which is a nice touch. A nice improvement I found is that Just doesn't fly back gaily when hit, unless he is in mid-air, which can be used to get this secret early if you know what you're doing. It just makes combat feel a bit faster, even though it does add the potential for being stun locked if you aren't careful. Basically, if you get hit, dodge backwards is the general rule, I think. The magic system is overhauled here and is tied to your sub-weapons equipped at the time. You find different spell books as you progress that add different elemental attributes to your sub-weapon attacks like ice, fire, and wind at the cost of magic points instead of hearts. Hearts kind of become a redundant commodity here, as once you get your first spell book, the increased damage the spells do kinda make going back to the standard sub-weapons a bit pointless, I feel. Progression throughout the game is a lot more streamlined than Circle of the Moon. You won't be getting lost as quickly, and it wasn't until around 60% in the first castle that I got stumped. Yes, I did say first castle. For reasons I won't go into for story spoilers, there are two castles to explore in Harmony of Dissonance, in a similar manner to Symphony, which had its inverted castle. There's basically the real castle and a demon version of the castle that you go back and forth throughout the game, only becoming apparent at the mid-game point. I like how there are actually visual differences between the two castles this time, with the demon castle being more decrepit and with different lighting effects, alongside the increased monster difficulty. It's also not quite as big of a difficulty spike when this happens as it was in Symphony of the Night, and overall, to be honest, this is generally a much easier game than both Symphony and definitely Circle of the Moon. If I had to make a critique, it would be that the dual castle approach can feel a bit like padding to make the game longer, and it could have been really cool if in the Demon Castle there were new areas to differentiate between the castles more. But it's not that big of a deal breaker, and Symphony did it too, so. You also have to remember there's only 1 year gap between Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance, so considering how much they managed to improve the visuals and gameplay in such a short time span is impressive.
Worthy of the name Belmont.
Which just leaves the last game made for the Game Boy Advance, and one that is generally regarded as one of the best games in the franchise, Aria of Sorrow. Originally released in 2003, once again a year after the previous game, and just before the PS2 entry Lament of Innocence, is something of a spiritual and thematic sequel to Symphony of the Night. It tells the story of Soma Cruz being drawn into Dracula's true castle after a solar eclipse in the year 2035, meaning that technically Lords of Shadow 2 wasn't the first game to be set in the future. Along the way he meets characters such as Yoko Belnardes, who is a descendant of Cypher Belnardes, and Genya Ardicado, who is not so subtly Alucard in disguise, and it also features multiple endings depending on player choice. Aria of Sorrow is much more similar to the design of Symphony of the Night than the previous two games in a lot of ways. There's also visual similarities in the first area that thematically tie it to Symphony. It also features the same transition screen between areas, which was actually originally done in Symphony as a way of loading the next music track between stages. Returning this time is the ability to wield numerous different weapons instead of just a whip. You get to use weapons varying from swords to axes and lances, with every weapon having different attack speeds and reach, meaning you can customize your playstyle a lot more, sacrifice damage for faster attacks, or become a tank at the expense of a slow attack rate. Aria of Sorrow also brings back the shop mechanic, which was absent in Circle of the Moon and a little bit pointless in Harmony of Dissonance. At the shop you can sell looted gear and acquire newer weapons periodically throughout the game, as well as stock up on curative items. Completely gone are the sub-weapons in Aria of Sorrow, replaced by another new magic system. Hearts now replenish your magic gauge, and I feel this change was likely due to how redundant the regular sub-weapons became in Harmony of Dissonance. In this game, abilities can now be absorbed from defeated enemies as you progress, that can be equipped to Soma, some of which are offensive like harpoons or magic attacks, whilst other abilities are tied to exploration like these wings that slow down your fall rate to reach far ledges, or having the ability to run on water surfaces. This is actually a mechanic that was used again in Koji Igarashi's latest game, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which was essentially a Castlevania game without the name. In terms of progression, Aria of Sorrow becomes less linear in design much faster than Harmony of Dissonance, but still in a much less obtuse manner than Circle of the Moon. It's pretty guided for the first couple of hours, but once you've acquired a few new abilities like the slide and double jump, you'll find you have a few different options in terms of exploration available, with your only clue of which way is the so-called optimal direction governed by how difficult the enemies become. I would say Aria is probably a more difficult game than Harmony, but this can also be mitigated if you have the patience to overlevel Soma. Overall, it is a very tightly designed and engaging Metroidvania experience, and while playing it, it's not hard to see why it's revered by so many fans, even if I personally feel that Symphony of the Night is still the series' high point, at least from what I've played. Aria of Sorrow then received a direct sequel on the Nintendo DS in 2005 called Dawn of Sorrow, and was one of 3 titles released exclusively on the system, along with Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia. I really hope Konami plans to do another collection with these titles, as I've never been able to play them properly, due to not having much luck with emulation at the time and the fact I've never owned a DS, nor do I want to pay exorbitant prices for second-hand copies online.
Why the fuck would anyone do that? Huh? Would you do that?
The Castlevania Advance collection is a very welcome surprise for sure from Konami, and I think it's definitely worth buying to show Konami that we would very much like a new game from the franchise, one that's not region locked and stuck on an Apple device. Given the popularity of the Netflix adaptation, I really hope this happens, and I know it's probably wishful thinking, but I would honestly love it if they outsourced the IP to From Software and let them have a crack at Castlevania. Seriously, Bloodborne in my opinion is the best 3D Castlevania game out there, as it both nails the gothic aesthetic and tone and the Metroidvania exploration perfectly. Just imagine what they could do with their design formula attached to the Castlevania lore, like using the whip for traversal or utilizing many of Alucard's special vampiric abilities. Please make this happen, someone. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this look and exploration of the Game Boy Advance era of Castlevania titles, and can appreciate why they were loved by so many people. Now, I promise my next video will finally be my deep dive into the interesting world of Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. Thank you so much to the people who have commented so far, and thank you so much for 50 subs in 3 months, it really means so much to me.